Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Mythology. Today we will be starting Module 7. In this module we will be looking at an important pairing of gods, Artemis and Apollo. Just to retrace our steps once again in terms of some of the major questions and themes that we've started to look at and will continue to look at throughout the course. We've talked somewhat on the nature and function of myth. What do myths do? What is their purpose? That's something we will continue to explore. Connected to this is the question of where do myths come from? Not only in their historical context and time frame, but this is also connected to the functionality and purpose of myth stories. We've also started to see that there's very often a close connection between myth and ritual practice. So this brings to the forefront the religious dimension of mythology as the kind of storytelling, theoretical, if you will, element of initiation practices and the way in which ancient people venerated the gods. And we'll continue to explore this in the coming weeks. We've also done some comparison between myths from different cultural contexts in order to trace developments and the evolution of these myth stories. Once again, none of them are particularly static. They do change over time depending on the emphasis and concerns and priorities of the different contexts in which they are told. So this transmission process is part of a constant reinterpretation of the stories. They take on new meanings and are told for different aims and agendas over time as they are passed from one generation to another and from one society to another. So the gods we are looking at today, Artemis and Apollo, are actually siblings. Artemis is the sister of Apollo, and Artemis is, of course, known as Diana to the Romans. And she is an example of a virgin goddess from the ancient Greek pantheon. And her virginity is something that's taken very seriously. And she is closely associated with the wilderness and the idea of the hunt. So unlike a goddess like Hestia, who is associated with the domestic sphere, or even Athena, who is really a goddess of the city and the life of the polis in ancient Greece, Artemis lives in the wild, so she is very much outside of the home and outside of the urban context. And as a result, this led to a number of associations in antiquity between Artemis and young women, as well as animals. Artemis is called in some of the sources Potnia Theron, which means mistress of beasts. So she is not only associated with practices like hunting. She's often depicted as carrying a bow and arrow, but she's also a protectress and patron of young women. And in the stories that are told about her, anyone who attempts to violate her sacred virginity usually meets a violent end. So examples of this are hunters such as Actaeon and Orion. Their stories are well known as to how Artemis deals with those who try to compromise her status. There's also a great deal of ambiguity around Artemis. Surprisingly, she's also a patron of childbirth and a protector of women in labor. In this function, she is known as Lokia. At the same time, she was also thought to be responsible for the death of women in labor, which was reflective of the high mortality rate in antiquity of women in childbirth. So there's again this notion of ambivalence. These deities often have positive and negative aspects. So here Artemis is both a protector of young women, but also can be responsible for punishing them. Now, one of the stories that is well known from Greek mythology is the story of Hippolytus. He was a young hunter who was devoted to Artemis, and he sought to remain an unmarried youth forever. So he embraced a kind of vow of eternal chastity in the honor of Artemis. This, not surprisingly, incurred the wrath of Aphrodite, because as the goddess of love and sexuality, she wants people to engage in erotic relations. So this decision by Hippolytus is seen as a act of defiance against Aphrodite. So she forces his stepmother, named Phaedra, to fall in love with him, which ultimately leads to his father Theseus cursing Hippolytus, and as a result he is trampled to death by horses. So here too we see the often violent nature of these myth stories when someone is perceived as violating the will of the gods. So in response to this, because Hippolytus was a devotee of Artemis, Artemis institutes a ritual in Hippolytus's honor. And this involves young women from the local town engaging in ritual mourning of Hippolytus before marriage. Now, ritual mourning is a somewhat commonplace type of practice in the ancient world. In this instance, it's been interpreted by some scholars to represent a sort of ritual mourning of the young women's own virginity, which they are expected to lose after being married. So, in this instance, we see this kind of interweaving of sexuality and violence, and that's something we're going to continue to discuss in the course of this module, because it is really something that we see again and again in classical myth stories. Remember the birth of Aphrodite herself. That was the result of an act of violence. And people are often portrayed in myth stories as being driven to madness because of desire, and the idea of love sickness was a common theme in ancient Greek literature. So both Artemis and Hippolytus are thus connected to important rites of passage. So this is yet another example of the close connection made between myth stories and ritual. We also have the example of the Boronia. East of the city of Athens, there was an initiation ritual for girls that took place at a place known as Boron. And here, 3 girls were selected to play the part of a bear in honor of Artemis, because there was a myth connected to Artemis in which a young girl is wounded by a bear and is then killed. So again, we see the violent element coming to the fore. And here again, there's an interpretation of this as representing the kind of death of youth and beginning of adulthood, and could be connected to maturity and the beginning of the menstrual cycle. This is one reading of the myth that scholars have put forward. But the Baronia seems to have functioned as a kind of ancient Greek camp for girls. There were dances and running races. There was a ritual that involved the girls kind of offering their playthings to Artemis in sacrifice. So in many societies, the rituals associated with growing up and maturity, sort of what we call life cycle rituals, are extremely important. And Artemis here is connected as a figure who's kind of on the boundary between sort of childhood and adulthood for young women. We know that at this site, however, a temple to Iphigenia has been found, which is quite interesting because Iphigenia is, in Greek mythology, she's the daughter of King Agamemnon. So King Agamemnon was the leader of the Trojan expedition. So when all the Greeks went off to conquer Troy because of the abduction of Helen, Agamemnon led the expeditionary force, but he had angered Artemis by killing one of her deer, so one of her sacred animals. So she halted the sailing of the expedition, and the only way to appease her, Agamemnon found out that he had to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, which he did. So again, a very violent sort of image, but it also, in a number of these contexts that we've gone through, there is a mythological association between young women and animals. So Iphigenia is offered as a kind of animal sacrifice. Animal sacrifice was the central religious ritual in antiquity. So that's the kind of thing that Iphigenia is subjected to. And from a modern perspective, this would certainly seem quite problematic, but it's not surprising in the context of a patriarchal society that often sees young women as a kind of a threatening and destabilizing element. So this equivalency that's made in many of these stories and rituals implies, in a very negative sense, I would say, that these young women have to be sort of domesticated and ritually cleansed of their kind of wild nature. So that's at least one of the initiation rituals that we know of associated with Artemis. There was also an initiation ritual for boys connected to Artemis that existed at Sparta. And this took place at the sanctuary to Artemis Orthia, Artemis the Upright. So often these gods and goddesses have many different titles that are kind of regionally based or associated with particular festivals. This too was a kind of maturity festival where the participants were involved in ritual lashing and the offering of blood. But we should remember that this is in the context of Spartan society, which was extremely militarized, where all young men were expected to essentially train and serve as soldiers. This has to do with the nature of Spartan society, where a small a number of elite citizens ruled over a extremely large population of slaves. So this also fits into the kind of ideological function of mythology, where the values of a particular society are reinforced through the storytelling and ritual actions that accompany those stories. Now, once again, we look to the Homeric hymns in terms of how they characterize these mythological figures. In this Homeric hymn to Artemis, the poet says, "I sing of Artemis with shafts that are of gold, strong-voiced, the revered virgin, deer-shooting delighter in arrows, own sister to Apollo of the golden sword." So we can already see these elements of hunting and virginity being brought to the forefront. Over the shadowy hills and windy peaks she draws her golden bow, rejoicing in the chase, and sends out grievous shafts. The tops of the high mountains tremble, and the tangled wood echoes awesomely with the outcry of beasts. Earth quakes, and the sea also where fishes shoal. So this imagery around Artemis and her associations with both virginity and hunting and the wilderness, I think this really has a kind of sociological implication in terms of the role and function of women in ancient Greek society. We know, particularly at Athens, that women were very much confined to the domestic sphere, and their primary function in that domestic sphere was to secure children and heirs for their husbands. So it's definitely not surprising that in that sort of societal dynamic, the imagery of a virgin goddess of the wilderness who kills anyone who tries to get close to her, there's a certain logic to it that's reflective of the gender dynamics and domestic politics of the ancient Greek city-state. The Homeric hymn continues, "But the goddess with a bold heart turns every way, destroying the race of wild beasts. And when she is satisfied and has cheered her heart, then the huntress who delights in arrows slackens her supple bow, and goes to the great house of her dear brother Phoebus Apollo, to the rich land of Delphi, there to order the lovely dance of the Muses and Graces." And as we'll see, her brother Apollo is very much associated with the city and sort of all aspects of civilization. So there's a kind of dichotomy there. But Artemis is depicted in really taking pleasure in hunting and her life outside of the urban space. But she occasionally visits her brother at his sacred shrine. There she hangs up her curved bow and her arrows, and heads and leads the dances, gracefully arrayed, while all they utter their heavenly voice, singing how neat-ankled Leto bore children supreme amongst the immortals, both in thought and deed. Hail to you, children of Zeus and rich-haired Leto. This is the mother of Artemis and Apollo. And now I will remember you in another song also. So the Homeric hymn tries to situate Artemis in the larger context of the Greek mythological pantheon, but she has some pretty unique functions and characteristics that we can interpret in a number of different ways. Some other literary references: we have mentions of Artemis in the Homeric poems, in the Iliad. She's called Artemis of the wilderness, not surprising, Lady of Wild Beasts. We've already looked at that title, Potnia Theron. But in a fragment from the dramatist Aeschylus, so this is one of the plays that isn't completely preserved, but only a quotation from it survives because it was cited by another author. Artemis is called Mistress Maiden, Despoina Nymphae, ruler of the stormy mountains. So another quite evocative image associated with this quite important Greek goddess. Now, as I've already mentioned, her brother Apollo contrasts quite dramatically with his sister, because he is essentially the god of culture and civilization, as well as being a patron of the medical arts. He's a god of healing, and his son Asclepius, who's also a healing god, is the patron of physicians. And in antiquity, healing practices and medicine were closely connected to religion generally and the worship of the gods. Apollo is also a god of prophecy, and he was famous for his predictions and oracles. The most famous oracle of Apollo was found at the city of Delphi in Greece. And this oracle, this is someone who speaks, a woman who speaks on behalf of Apollo. She's goes into a kind of trance and makes utterances that are interpreted probably by attendants or priests. People would come from far and wide to consult this spokesperson for Apollo on various matters. But the answers were notoriously ambiguous and easily misinterpreted. One of the most famous examples of this has to do with King Croesus, who was the king of Lydia. This story is told by Herodotus. As the Persian Empire was rising in the east, Croesus felt threatened because his kingdom was in Asia Minor, which was modern-day Turkey. And he wondered whether he should, resist the rise of the Persians or surrender to them. So he consulted the oracle of Apollo, and the oracle told him that if he went to war against Persia, a great kingdom would fall. So he naturally interpreted this to mean that he would be victorious, that it was a good idea to go to war against Persia. But of course, what the oracle actually meant that he would be sacrificing his own kingdom. So these sort of double meanings and ambiguous interpretations of the oracles of Apollo were a kind of trope in ancient literature. Another popular saying associated with Apollo is this idea of know thyself, or nothing in excess. So Apollo is frequently cited as a god of sort of self-knowledge, but also moderation and control. So again, he's the sort of opposite of his sister, who's sort of running wild in the wilderness. Apollo is the one who's meant to kind of stabilize civilization. Now, the priestess at Delphi was known as the Pythia, and as I already said, she spoke on behalf of the deity. And among Apollo's spheres of patronage, or not only the arts, but specifically music. He is often depicted with the lyre, which was an ancient kind of harp-like instrument. And that has to do with the idea in antiquity that music and kind of musical theory was somehow representative of the kind of harmony of the universe. So if Apollo is the god of reason, then he would naturally have jurisdiction over the kind of rationality and structures that govern all things, including musical theory. Like his sister, Apollo also presided over initiation rituals, usually for young men. And as the patron of civilization, and since Greek society viewed men as the kind of creators of culture and politics, again, that's a problematic idea from a modern perspective. Apollo was the one who was thought to help young men prepare for public life and engaging with the urban environment. So one of the aspects of the initiation ritual was cutting of the hair. Long hair was associated with youth, short hair associated with adulthood. So this cutting of the hair was a kind of rite of passage for young men who went through this festival known as the Hyacinthia. So in both cases, the stories told about Artemis and Apollo, we see another example of what we might think of Malinowski's functionalist interpretation of myth. So in both cases, the stories told about these gods seem very much orientated towards reinforcing gender roles and the place of men and women in society, and especially in the transition from childhood to maturity. So again, they're not stories that are just simply told for no reason or for pure entertainment purpose, but they have this very important contribution to make in terms of solidifying the existing social structures and values. And this, of course, is one of the primary functions of mythology in any society, including our own, I would argue. Now, if we looked towards the east of the ancient world, we see a somewhat different version of these deities. And there was a quite important book published several years ago by the classical scholar M.L. West that was called The East Face of Helicon. And in this book, West demonstrated that in antiquity, and I've mentioned this in previous modules, but in antiquity, there was a fair amount of interpenetration between what we would call Greek and Roman, well, especially Greek mythological traditions and Near Eastern mythological traditions. And the influence goes both ways, but West intended to show that a number of important elements and characters and stories from Greek mythology are influenced by prototypes we find particularly in Mesopotamia, but also Asia Minor, which is also known as Anatolia in the ancient context. So, for instance, in Anatolia, we find in some local textual evidence references to a god named Apollonius. This is quite reminiscent of Apollo, and Apollo's name is pretty much impossible to interpret from a Greek linguistic perspective, so it's probably non-Greek in origin. And the fact that we find this god with a similar sounding name in a society that was just to the east of the Greek city-states would, be a good basis for looking for connections between the two. And this deity is also associated with an important Hittite city. The Hittites were a major power in the region just prior to the classical period. And we find evidence of the god Apollonius at the city of Wilusa, which is a possible candidate for the mythical city of Troy. That's another question. We also have in Asia Minor the goddess Cybele and the Great Mother, and we've already got a glimpse of these figures when we were looking at the tradition of Aphrodite and the universal goddess, but this deity is also closely connected to Artemis. So at the city of Ephesus, which was a significant Greek colony in Asia Minor, and which was made up of a mixed population of Greek colonists and a local population, there was a very famous temple of Artemis known as the Artemisium, and this was considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And there is iconography of Artemis from this context that portrays her much more like a fertility goddess and as a patron of wealth and abundance. So that's somewhat far removed from the kind of virgin huntress we see in other more classical myth stories about Artemis. But there's even a Hellenistic ancient Greek novel in which this Artemis is associated with the city of Ephesus. This is called the Ephesian Tale, and in the story, a young man of Ephesus named Habrocomes is treated like a deity, and he practices hunting and horse riding. He rejects the power of Eros, so he's something like a Hippolytus kind of figure. But in this instance, it's Eros or Cupid who gets angry. Eros seeks to punish Habrocomes by causing him to fall in love with a young woman at a festival of Artemis. So the oracle of Apollo is consulted, and the decision is made by the parents that the young couple should be married. And so, without giving too much away in the story, it's another example of Artemis being associated with the kind of initiation, rite of passage, sort of ritual preparation for marriage, that sort of a thing. This all plays a role in this fictional narrative and love story that's kind of under the patronage of the goddess Artemis, but it has this close connection with Ephesus. Now, as I've mentioned a number of times in this lecture, we've seen increasing evidence of the close connection between mythology and ritual practice. And this was explored in the late 19th century and early 20th century by a number of influential scholars at Cambridge University. In particular, Jane Ellen Harrison, who took this approach far in the sense that she understood myths as essentially ritual dramas, and that for her it was sort of axiomatic that myths always reflect ritual, ritual always communicates myth. Now, this certainly, well, this isn't necessarily true in every case, and in fact, in most instances, we would have no idea of what ritual accompanied each particular myth. I mean, there's so many different stories that were told, it's kind of hard to imagine that every single one would form the basis of some kind of ritual practice. But that's not to say that many didn't have important ritual components, especially connected to kind of milestones in life and the kind of trajectory of human experience. But at the very least, the Cambridge ritualists, as they were called, including Harrison, did place emphasis on the importance of context to interpret mythology. So that is a major contribution. So instead of just looking at these stories on a kind of surface level, it is always, I think, a good idea to at least think about what kind of procedure or ritual action could be lying behind the telling of this story. That speaks to the purpose and function of the story itself. So this means that myths were no longer simply literary artifacts, because that is often how they are viewed, just as interesting stories from antiquity, but as stories that tell us something about society. So that's also one of the priorities of this course. You could imagine a course like this where we simply go through a bunch of myth stories and learn all the characters and storylines, and that would be great. But we want to take a further step and ask, well, why were these stories told, and what did they tell us about the storytellers and the audience who heard the stories and very likely engaged in some sort of activity in response to these stories? Another scholar, Arnold van Gennep, he was also interested in myths as representing rites of passage. And we've already seen in the case of Artemis and Apollo a number of examples of this. Rituals typically are things that mark changes and transitional moments in both individual life and community life. Initiation rituals help people integrate into society and take up their expected roles. So there we're back to this functionalism idea. So it's not surprising that initiation rituals associated with Artemis and Apollo were meant to reinforce the kind of gender expectations that Greek society put forward. But often such initiations involve a temporary relocation. The individual is taken out of their ordinary context and sent out to the country or on a voyage or trip in which the ritual of transition takes place. So they use things like disorder and dislocation in order to kind of recreate order and push people to a different level of development. And they sometimes involve reversal of social norms and values. So, often if there's definitely a kind of transformational element that accompanies many of these initiation rituals. So we will pause there in our look at Artemis and Apollo, and in the next installment of this module, we will take a more detailed look at a particular story that's associated with Apollo in classical mythological tradition, but one that has become particularly controversial in recent years. And we'll explore some of the reasons why that is in the next installment.